Hey everybody, Nick here, and today we're going to do a little bit of disassembly and maintenance on this little guy right here. This is the Kizer Knives Kizer Flashbang Mini, and this is the M390 edition. First though, of course, Kizer unfortunately has the policy that if you disassemble your knife to maintain it, the warranty is null and void, and that's ugly. That's something I really hope Kizer changes. But we're going to go on ahead and press ahead because, well, you can't always send your knife back to China to clean it out. So let's just pretend we didn't see that little sign. This guy is actually pretty straightforwardly constructed. You've just got two screws, this guy, and then a couple of others for the clip and the lock bar insert, but we'll go ahead and just pop it open. Pardon me. In many ways, I suspect that's just because Kizer knows that they use very, very soft screws relative to other manufacturers, and they just don't want warranty issues that come about because people strip out these screws. It's very easy to do. Luckily, this particular knife did not come with any Loctite on the screws. I'd like to think that's a changing policy. But whatever it is, I appreciated it very much, and now the knife is taken apart and ready to maintain. God, this thing is clean. So on the inside here, we see that this is just it's a normal frame lock. There's not a whole lot going on here. I'm going to use some 91% rubbing alcohol here. Go ahead and, pardon me. Just start cleaning. One little bit of unfortunate is that Kizer puts on their knives, for whatever reason, this kind of tacky made in China sticker. I get that it's regulatory, but it's a little bit of a pain to get off of there, and actually rubbing alcohol is one of the better solutions to get the adhesive residue off of there. So that's something I knew I was going to be taking this down, so I didn't bother cleaning that off yet, but nonetheless. So now that's... Be careful when you're wiping a blade down like this to always stroke away from the blade or parallel to it. You don't ever want to stroke up onto the blade because that's a really good way to shave your finger off. And generally you want your finger to stay on. Just thinking aloud here. But all right, just cleaning this little area out here. Now we're going to go ahead and pop out the bearing. There goes the bearing. And clean out the bearing race. We can actually see that there appears to be a separate stainless steel bearing race inside the blade here, which is good in a lot of ways. Titanium does have a tendency, because it's a little softer, to, oh, come on, you little bugger, to deform. I've heard horror stories. Pardon me. God, guys, can't talk today. Anyways, I've heard horror stories of people who, you know, their knife underwent some sort of a trauma. It was dropped well open. There's something along those lines. And they look inside the knife and there are little dimples in the bearing race from where, in the titanium, from where the blade hit. You know, that's not super common. It's not something I'm worried about on a regular basis. But that is one advantage of a stainless steel race, is you don't have that concern. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking these little bearings, and by the way, these are different than the bearings I've seen on Kizer knives in the past. They look like little ceramics or something along those lines. The action is pretty compelling, so whatever. But yeah, and so I'm just kind of cleaning these guys off right here. But on the inside here, I gotta say, this knife is impressing me. There's no real issue here because, honestly, it's a well-constructed little frame lock. There's no complexity really to it. It's a fine little knife. So these sides are both clean. There's no other steel in this guy. I don't need to worry about rust or rust protection. So I'm just going to oil the inside here. Oh, one other step is I'm going to take some this rubbing alcohol that's pooled over here and go ahead and clean out the inside of the pivot hole. Just because that's one area that grime can... Oh, look, I popped out that bearing race. You can actually see that the bearing race is slid around just a little bit here. Actually, I'll try and do that on the other side as well. There's absolutely no reason why you really need to clean behind this. The only issue that could come up is if there was a lot of moisture that got behind this steel. There's a possibility that it might corrode a little bit. In the grand scheme, I'm not at all worried about that, but it is something you can take a look at. Also going to clean the pivot here. And I'm going to slide this guy through the hole in the blade. Again, I'm just trying to remove any gunk. associated with this, because as you wear a brand new knife in, you will always create a little bit of gunk that will slow the action down. The action on this knife is very, very good, so I don't want to see that happen. All right, now we've got this guy fully disassembled. Let's go ahead and put it back together. I'm going to use this 10-weight nano oil here, but there are lots of fish in the sea, so to speak. You can also use Dewa real oil, no problem. There's a private selection oil out there that's pretty fine. Even frog lube or something like that would work okay. So I'm just putting a little bit into the bearing race here, and I'm using the applicator tip just to distribute it in there. Next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and put a little bit of lubrication on the pivot itself before I insert the pivot. That way when I actually do insert the pivot, it'll kind of, I don't know, it'll distribute it a little bit more evenly. There went my bearing race. Just a second. Downside of sitting on the pleather chair as you're doing this is you get some interesting noises. Anyways, moving along. Now, one thing you're going to note here is, good God, man, I'm not having a stellar morning in terms of keeping things together. It's okay. One thing you'll note here is that this is a D-shaped little pivot, and that this pivot actually has a D shape on there, which means this is not free spinning, which is a beautiful thing in and of itself, but it is something you have to keep in mind as you're doing this disassembly. You want to make sure that this pivot is in the proper position when you go to put everything back together, or else, well, everything's not going to go back together. So, there we go. Something to keep in mind. Next step, I'm going to drop a bearing onto this guy. And what I'm going to do here is just use the, because I applied a little bit of oil to the bearing race, I'm just going to use this oiler tip here to, there we go. Just distribute that oil, kind of roll the bearings around and distribute the oil onto them fairly evenly. There we go. Next step here is going to be to go ahead and drop on the blade. Well, again, make sure I've got that D shape in the proper position. Step after that is going to be, I forgot a little step. Next step is actually going to be, you can see there's a little bit of oil on the pivot area already, but I'm going to go ahead and put some oil specifically into the detent ball hole, and then just smear it right across the detent ball track. I'm running this knife a little wet, but that's okay. I like my knives a little wet, so they attract lint a little bit more easily that way. That's not a good thing, but they tend to run a little smoother. Next step is going to be to drop your stop pin into this little D-shaped stop pin track. These internal stop pin tracks are great, except it does mean that this will collect crud, and after a long enough time, you'll be in a situation, that is, where you do need to take the knife apart and clean it. So again, those no disassembly warranties are kind of ugly in those situations. Now I'm just spinning the bearings a little bit here so that they get a nice coating of the oil I've applied to the side of the blade. Now I'm actually, because I know the bearing race doesn't want to stay in, what I'm going to do here is just apply a little grease to the inside, and then I'm just going to set the bearing race down on top of the bearing. And now there's a nice little sandwich, and all I have to do is drop on this top scale here. Is there anything else I got to do here? I only have 3 pots out. These 3 guys, okay, yeah, we're all set. Let's go ahead and put this guy the rest of the way back together. I'm checking to make sure that my D shape is towards the top. It appears to be, so that's nice. Even if it wasn't, one thing that you can do is use the handle itself as sort of a wrench to scoot it in the right position. But in this case, it appears to be. Next step is going to be to use the lock bar to kind of release the lock bar, and that actually lets you sandwich everything together a little bit more tightly. Unfortunately, I've done it prematurely. This may just disassemble itself spontaneously. By the way, it's using the same screw head size on both sides, a Torx T8, which I appreciate. I just caught on to that fact. Well done, Kizer. You know, it's a shame that the disassembly policy is that way, because this knife is actually kind of a pleasure to take apart. There's no real issue with it whatsoever in disassembly, so, you know, there you go. And I'm just going to kind of drop this guy on there, finger tight for the moment. Now what I'm going to do, and I'm just applying a little bit of Loctite blue. If you lose, I'm sorry. If you use red Loctite, you're gonna have a bad time. You're never gonna get it back apart. The blue stuff just helps to make sure, oh, you little bugger. The blue stuff just helps to make sure the screw isn't gonna back itself out afterwards. So there we go. I locked that guy down. Now what I'm gonna do is just lock the pivot the rest of the way down here. And again, it's a good idea to manipulate, to kind of open the lock bar up, so that way that's out of play as you're tightening down the pivot. Now I'm going to finish this guy, torquing that down, make sure the torque's good there. The pivot is currently all the way torqued down, and the action is still very good. I always ask myself the question, does the action improve any if I slightly reduce the torque on the pivot? Doesn't appear to. How about if I go a little further? Now I got a little bit of blade play, so no. So I'm just going to crank it. Backing it off very, very slightly. And remember, one of the joys of using the Loctite is that it'll actually stay in whatever rotation you put it in. So you can really dial it in, and it's perfect. There we go. So the knife is back together, and it's running better than ever. This is a really nice knife in a lot of ways, and this disassembly just shows that, you know, they did a very simple thing very, very well here. And I always appreciate that. And so, straightforward, smooth sailing over calm seas. There we go. Hope this was interesting to you, and that you enjoy your mini flashbang, and that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of the day. Keep an eye out for the full review of this guy coming up here shortly. Bye now.